you very much, Prime Minister. Now let's move on to the speech of Leader of Opposition.
Here, here. Here. Mr. Chair, the stance of opposition in today's debate is that we do not support these national and international bodies that govern the evolution of language. Instead, we regret it for one reason, precisely because we believe in the natural evolution of languages, and we think this has to be maintained in order to maintain its role in the society, which is to continually reflect the culture and identity of that particular community, ladies and gentlemen, which they say they want to defend in today's debate. Essentially, I'm getting two things from Prime Minister. They want to prevent the overshadowing of other languages. They want to prevent hegemony of other languages. And second, they want to maintain social order. On the first level, we agree. We have to prevent hegemony of other languages. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is something we can do without governing the evolution of a particular language. Mr. Chair and members of this House, we say if you want to suppress the overshadowing of other language, then what you have to do is either A, empower the other languages out there, which we think should be empowered in the same way as well. But number two, ladies and gentlemen, have education necessary in order for those people who belong to the other community to fight for their own language, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. Why do we have to institutionalize it to the level that these particular in the case of governing bodies and national bodies or international agencies, Mr. Speaker, are the ones governing the evolution of language. In our case, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to discuss how these governing bodies actually impose standards on how to develop and evolve that particular language, which we think is harmful to the basic role and basic duty of a particular language in the first place. So we say social order can also happen under our model. It's just that we're not doing it their way. We're doing it in other ways, Mr. Speaker and members of this House. So at the end of the day, the goal which they want to forward at the end of the day is still achievable under our model without necessarily governing and dictating the direction of the evolution of a particular language. And that's why we say, ladies and gentlemen, on both accounts we agree, but we have to do it without governing it, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of evolution. So let's talk about my case in today's debate. For that, yes.
Respond to our case that in order to achieve that goal of empowerment, we have to intervene and try to set order and break the power structures being imposed with the natural order that you are trying to defend.
Mr. Chair, the power structures, again, can be broken down by other means, such as educating people belonging in that community, or such as empowering the languages that, hey, your language is not necessarily superior to this language, but your language necessarily is equal in terms of footing or status to those other languages. Those are things which we can do to empower those languages as well without governing and dictating the direction of the evolution of a particular language. This is our own language, Filipino language. Let's talk about my case in today's debate, how natural evolution is necessary to continually reflect the kind of culture and identity that a community has. Because we think, Mr. Speaker, that natural evolution involves no dictation of what direction the evolution is going. But when you talk about a governing body, you necessarily impose certain standards and impose certain directions as to which direction a particular evolution should go, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House, such as a state, for example. It's a governing body which imposes standardizations on different aspects of society's life, such as a family, for example. It's a governing body of the children, which imposes the values and religion of a particular culture of the members of that particular institution, such as clubs and organizations, for example, which have governing bodies which imposes rules and standards of what are acceptable and what are not, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. The point is, when you are a governing body, when you talk about a governing institution, you necessarily impose certain standards which you want these members to actually conform to, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. But of course, on the opposition side, we're not saying that standardization in general is bad. What we're saying is standardization in this case is something we cannot accept, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. Because when you talk about language, it's an intrinsic part of a community's culture. This is what they use for transmitting values and cultures from one generation to another. It's their tool for communication, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. Meaning, it's a part of that community's identity and a part and reflective of their particular culture, ladies and gentlemen, which they feel, ladies and gentlemen, is connected to the very aspects of their lives. When you talk about evolution, it's a process that is reflective of a cultural change. It's a change in culture that is necessarily reflects a a new ideology, for example, or an influx of a new particular idea, ladies and gentlemen, which they think should be incorporated in their own culture, which means it necessarily affects the kind of language that a community has, because a change in culture necessarily also changes a part which basically make that culture exist in the first place, which is language. So basically we're saying the language is an inherent part of that particular culture, which actually reflects the changes that happen in that particular culture, Mr. Speaker, and members of this House. Thus, we say this is a cultural aspect that should be left to develop on their own, which is why, Mr. Speaker, we think that the state, as much as possible, wants to respect the rights to choice of individuals, for example, because they think that the individuals are the best ones to assess and the best agents to assess, ladies and gentlemen, what direction their lives should be going, because their choices determine the quality of their lives. Their choices determine what kind of direction they should go, ladies and gentlemen, to achieve the full saturation of that life. We think that the state also tries to respect those choices and not impose certain standards, ladies and gentlemen, to govern that particular choice, to which an individual should make, ladies and gentlemen, to which an individual should go, rather, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. That's why we say letting it grow and evolve on its own, Mr. Speaker, is the only way for it to continually reflect that particular change in the community, Mr. Chair, and members of this House. And imposing standards through by which they have to abide, ladies and gentlemen, on which part of evolution should continue, or which kind of evolution should they go, ladies and gentlemen, is necessarily an abridgment towards this particular role, which is to continually reflect those particular changes in their cultures, ladies and gentlemen, and in their identity. Remember, Mr. Speaker, that the language is a tool for communication of these particular cultures. The language is a tool for them to continually reflect themselves, ladies and gentlemen, as no, this is an identity which I have to maintain, ladies and gentlemen, and the cultures that happen in my own identity necessarily is reflected in the kind of language and the evolution of language that that particular community has, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. That's why we say, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, we agree on both accounts. We have to prevent hegemony, we have to maintain social order, but we say we don't have to do that by governing that particular evolution. We can do that through other ways, such as making use of the state institutions which maintain and empower the other languages out there. Because we say, ladies and gentlemen, governing means imposing standards, and we say this is something we regret when you talk about the evolution of language. With that, we post. Thank you.
Here, here, here.